The July sun was beating down on the headstones at a cemetery in Washington, D.C., when passers-by noticed a man slumped against a grave. At first, it seemed like just another mourner overcome by grief. But as they drew closer, the awful truth revealed itself. The man wasn't just grieving, he was gone. In his hand was a folded note, smeared with ink from tears. On the paper, a single line stood out. "Razik, I really tried." It was the grave of his 3-year-old son. The man was Donald Curtis, better known to the world as Big Boss Dono, a beloved local rapper, muralist, and community mentor. His body was found at the very place where he had buried his child months earlier. The community was stunned, left gasping for answers. How did a rising star, a father, a man admired for his resilience, come to this devastating end? The story of Donald Curtis, stage name Big Boss Dono, isn't just about music, or fame, or even tragedy. It's about the unbearable weight of grief, the silence that can swallow a man whole, and the choices that leave a community reeling. Donald was born and raised in the southeast corridor of Washington, D.C., a place known for its grit, survival, and resilience. Life there had never been easy, but for Donald, hardship became a kind of paint on his canvas. Before he was known as a rapper, he was known for something else. His murals. Bright, bold, and unflinching, they were more than color splashed across walls. They were declarations of identity. In every line of paint, he carved out a voice for those who had none. But Donald's story was never just about art. Music came next. His beats were raw, his lyrics unapologetic. He rapped about survival, about dodging bullets, about the pressure of being young and black in D.C. The streets knew him not only as an artist but as an authentic voice who refused to bend. His rise in the local rap scene came fast, and it came loud. Controversy followed him, most famously a nightclub scuffle involving the group Migos. But nothing could derail his trajectory. What set him apart wasn't only his sound. It was his love for family. And above all, it was his devotion to his son, Razik Williams. Razik wasn't just a child in Donald's life, he was a lifeline. From the moment Donald first laid eyes on the boy, he knew his world had shifted forever. Friends say Razik gave Donald something music never could: a reason to slow down, to breathe, to live differently. Nights that might have been spent in clubs or trouble were replaced with bedtime stories and quiet moments at home. Donald often admitted that fatherhood had saved him, but then, in early 2021, life delivered its cruelest blow. Little Razik, not yet 4 years old, was diagnosed with cancer. The news hit like a wrecking ball. One moment, Donald was planning music releases and painting murals. The next, he was living in hospitals, watching chemotherapy drip into his child's veins. Every parent prays they'll never hear those words. Your child has cancer. For Donald, the world dimmed in that instant. From the outside, people saw a man determined to fight for his son. He shared updates on social media, speaking with rare vulnerability. He posted photos of Razik's small hand clutching his, videos of hospital visits, even messages of hope that tried to convince everyone, including himself, that everything would be okay. But behind those posts was a different reality. Anxiety ate at him. Nights passed without sleep. He'd sit alone, staring at the ceiling, questioning God. How could a higher power allow this? How could innocence be punished so cruelly? The struggle wasn't just Razik's, it was Donald's too. While the boy endured rounds of chemotherapy with quiet courage, Donald's spirit began to fracture. He confessed in late-night posts that he felt weak, that he cried alone but put on a brave face for others. He admitted that faith wavered, that strength sometimes felt like a performance, and yet, he never stopped showing up. At every appointment, every bedside vigil, he was there. Friends admired him for it, but they also saw the cracks. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. His voice, once filled with swagger, often trembled when he spoke about Razik. Then came January 2024. Despite endless treatments, despite hope and prayers, little Razik's body couldn't fight anymore. On the 9th of January, he passed away. For Donald, the world shattered. Imagine, for a moment, the silence of a home where a child's laughter once lived. Imagine walking past a bedroom where toys still wait for small hands that will never return. That was Donald's reality. He tried to stay strong for family, for his community, for the fans who looked to him as a symbol of resilience. But inside, he was hollow. The grief of losing a child isn't something words can capture. It's not just loss, it's the theft of a future. Donald often said Razik wasn't just his son, but his purpose. And now, that purpose was gone. In the months that followed, people noticed the change. He withdrew, spending long hours alone. He painted less, rapped less. When he did speak, his words carried the weight of someone carrying an invisible stone strapped to his chest. On Instagram, he hinted at despair. "I really tried," he wrote in one post. His followers, used to bold declarations, suddenly saw a man whispering into the void. By July 2025, a year and a half after Razik's death, Donald seemed to unravel completely. On the morning of the 21st of July, he posted what no one knew would be his final message. He apologized to his family. He said he couldn't take it anymore. He wrote to his son, "I tried." Hours later, at the cemetery, his body was discovered. The city of Washington, D.C. froze in disbelief. Vigils sprang up. Murals of Donald appeared across walls he himself once painted. His community mourned, not just an artist, but a father, a mentor, a man who had given everything until he had nothing left. But as grief spread, so did questions. Could anyone have saved him? Was his death inevitable, written in the grief of losing a child? Or was it the silence, the inability to ask for help that truly killed him? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what happens to a man when the very thing that gave him purpose is ripped away? Before we dive deeper into the moments that shaped Donald's final years, the fame, the family, the pain that no one could see, pause with me here. Because this isn't just his story, it's a mirror held up to every parent who has ever feared the unthinkable, to every soul who has ever carried grief too heavy to speak aloud. And there are details still hidden. Moments behind closed doors that might change how you see everything that followed. Before tragedy took center stage, before headlines screamed about a rapper found lifeless at his son's grave, there was just a boy growing up in the heart of Washington, D.C. His name was Donald Curtis, but to the streets that shaped him, he would later be known as Big Boss Dono. Donald's story begins in Southeast D.C., a part of the city known for its sharp contrasts. On one block, you could find children playing on cracked sidewalks, their laughter cutting through the air. On the next, gunfire, sirens, and the heavy weight of survival replaced joy. This was the environment that raised him a world where every decision could tilt toward promise or peril. As a child, Donald absorbed everything. He saw murals splashed across buildings, painted by hands that wanted to leave a mark in a place often forgotten. Those images stuck with him. Long before he ever picked up a microphone, he picked up cans of spray paint. With bold colors and steady strokes, he began to tell stories on concrete canvases. His murals weren't random graffiti. They were testaments of identity, faces of black leaders, tributes to neighborhood legends, messages of pride. These were his first songs, sung not with beats but with brush strokes. But art wasn't enough to shield him from the temptations and dangers outside. Like many young men in his neighborhood, Donald brushed shoulders with the streets. Violence wasn't an abstract idea, it was an everyday threat. He had friends who didn't make it to 20, boys who ended up behind bars before they had a chance to discover who they were. Donald himself wasn't immune to trouble. He carried scars, some visible, some invisible, from a world that demanded toughness at every turn. And yet, through all of this, there was a spark in him that couldn't be dimmed. Music came next. At first, it was casual rapping with friends, trading rhymes at parties, recording rough tracks that bounced from phone to phone. But the more he rapped, the more people noticed. His words weren't just rhymes, they were reflections of real life. He didn't sugarcoat. He didn't pretend. He rapped about what he saw, what he felt, and what his community lived through every day. By 2015, Donald, now known as Big Boss Dono, was carving a reputation. His style was gritty, unpolished, but undeniably authentic. Crowds respected him because he wasn't faking it. He was one of them, telling their story through rhythm and rhyme. Local shows filled quickly. Tracks like Lego Me became neighborhood anthems. The streets of D.C. had their own storyteller, one who gave voice to their struggles and pride. But success didn't come without shadows. Fame brought attention, and attention brought conflict. One of the most notorious moments in his career came at Stadium nightclub, where a brawl broke out involving Dono and the rap group Migos. For some, it was a scandal. For others, it was proof of his authenticity. He wasn't afraid to stand his ground. Either way, the incident only amplified his name. Still, as his star rose, Donald carried something heavier than ambition. Behind the bravado, behind the stage lights and murals, was a man trying to escape cycles of violence he had grown up with. Friends recall him admitting that he had missed so many bullets simply because life had pulled him in another direction. And that direction had a name: Razik. Donald didn't plan on becoming a father so young. When he first heard he had a son, his reaction was disbelief. He joked with friends that he thought it was a mistake. But then, he saw the boy. Razik's eyes, wide and searching, mirrored his own. In that moment, denial melted into certainty. The child was his, and more importantly, he was going to be there. Fatherhood wasn't a role Donald slid into easily. He admitted he didn't know what he was doing. Nights of parties turned into nights of bottle feeding. Days once filled with hustling for shows became days of working just to provide stability. But slowly, Razik transformed him. The boy's presence softened edges that the streets had sharpened. Where bullets once flew, laughter now filled the air. Where anger once lived, patience began to grow. Those closest to Donald say, Razik didn't just give him purpose, he gave him redemption. He often told friends that his son saved him. Every time he looked at Razik, he saw a reason to avoid the traps that had taken so many men before him. He poured himself into fatherhood with the same energy he once poured into art and music. It wasn't always easy. Money was tight, fame was fickle, and stress followed him like a shadow. But Donald never backed down. He posted videos of Razik, shared their adventures online, and spoke openly about how much the boy meant to him. Fans saw not just a rapper but a devoted father, a man reshaped by love. Yet, in the quiet corners of his life, storms brewed. The streets still whispered his name, and the pressures of maintaining success in music weighed heavy. Every mural, every track, every public appearance was more than art, it was survival. And while fatherhood gave him reason to keep going, it also made him fear the fragility of everything he had built. Then came the moment that would test him in ways nothing else ever could. Razik's diagnosis. The details hit like thunder. A doctor's words shattered the fragile balance Donald had created. His son, his lifeline, his anchor was sick. Cancer didn't care about their love. It didn't care about music or murals. It didn't care that Donald had clawed his way out of danger to build something better. It came anyway, merciless and uninvited. From that point on, Donald's life split in two. Publicly, he was the fighter, the father who never left his son's side, the man who shared hopeful updates to inspire others. Privately, he was crumbling, caught between wanting to believe and fearing the worst. Every late-night hospital visit, every exhausted drive home left him with more questions than answers. Why his son? Why now? And perhaps the most painful question of all. What if love wasn't enough to save him? As Razik fought through treatments, Donald began fighting a different kind of battle, one with himself. Faith battled despair. Strength battled exhaustion. Hope battled reality. It was in these moments, hidden from cameras and fans, that Donald began to fracture. And though no one knew it then, those cracks would widen until they swallowed him whole. But before we confront that collapse, we need to ask, was Donald already carrying the seeds of tragedy long before Razik got sick? Was grief waiting, crouched in the shadows of his past, just waiting for the right moment to strike? Because sometimes, the most haunting stories don't begin with loss. They begin with the weight of survival and the question of how much one's soul can endure before it finally breaks. Hospitals have their own rhythm. The steady beep of machines, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of nurses moving from room to room. For most people, they are places of passing a quick visit, a moment of care. But for Donald Curtis, better known as Big Boss Dono, hospitals became home. It was here, in sterile rooms filled with the scent of disinfectant, that he and his young son Razik waged a battle no parent ever dreams of facing. The diagnosis had come swiftly. In early 2021, when Razik was just 3 years old, doctors confirmed what Donald had feared but refused to believe. Cancer. The word itself seemed to echo in his mind, refusing to settle into reality. His little boy, so full of energy, so full of life, was suddenly defined by a sickness too cruel to comprehend. Donald's first reaction was disbelief. He had grown up battling poverty, dodging violence, enduring hardships that would break many men. But this was different. You can't fight cancer in the streets. You can't out-rap it, out-paint it, or outrun it. Cancer doesn't care about the resilience of a father or the innocence of a child. It just takes. From that moment on, Donald's life revolved around hospital visits. Mornings began with medication schedules. Afternoons blurred into consultations with doctors who spoke in clinical terms while Donald searched for hope between the lines. Nights ended with him slumped in uncomfortable chairs beside his son's hospital bed, whispering promises that everything would be okay even when he wasn't sure he believed it himself. But if the illness was merciless, so was Razik's spirit. Despite the IV lines, the endless pokes of needles, and the exhausting treatments, the little boy fought bravely. Nurses would later recall how he smiled through rounds of chemotherapy, as if determined to remind his father that even in pain, there could be light. Donald, however, was unraveling. On Instagram, he shared snapshots of their journey, photos of Razik giving a tired thumbs up, videos of playful moments snatched between treatments. To his followers, he appeared strong, resilient, unbreakable. But the truth lived in the shadows of those posts. Behind the camera, when the hospital corridors emptied and silence filled the room, Donald would break down. He cried quietly so his son wouldn't hear. He questioned God in whispers he never posted online. On the 7th of November, 2023, he shared a long, emotional message to his son on Instagram. He admitted to struggling with faith, admitting that he sometimes asked God why when he shouldn't. He confessed that strength felt like a mask, that he cried in secret but smiled in public because he didn't want Razik to see his weakness. In the post, he promised to keep fighting, to stand beside his son every step of the way. But reading between the lines, you could already feel the weight crushing him. This is the part of grief people rarely talk about: the slow erosion of hope. Every day, Donald walked into the hospital, determined to believe in a miracle. Every night, he walked out carrying more fear than the day before. Friends noticed the change. His music slowed, his murals appeared less frequently, and when he did speak publicly, there was a softness, a fragility in his voice that hadn't been there before. Still, he kept showing up. That was the paradox of his pain. Even when his spirit fractured, he remained at his son's bedside, determined to shield him from the depths of his despair. To the world, he was still the fighter. To Razik, he was still Dad. But inside, Donald was splitting in two: the man who had to stay strong, and the man who could barely stand. By January 2024, the battle had reached its cruelest stage. Despite endless treatments, despite the prayers, and the late-night bargains whispered into the void, Razik's little body couldn't take any more. On the 9th of January, doctors delivered the words Donald had dreaded from the beginning. There was nothing else they could do. That night, Razik took his last breath with his parents at his side. What happens in the silence after a child dies? There are no words to explain it. Friends say Donald sat in the hospital room long after everyone else had left, staring at the stillness that had replaced his son's laughter. For a man who had once rapped about surviving bullets, about dodging death in the streets, the greatest wound came not from violence but from loss. In the weeks that followed, Donald disappeared into himself. He attended the funeral, stood at the graveside, listened as people spoke of Razik's short but bright life. But afterward, when the crowds left and the condolences faded, he was left alone with the unbearable weight of silence. His Instagram posts changed. The playful videos of Razik were replaced with cryptic words about pain, despair, and trying to hold on. "I really tried," he wrote in one haunting caption. Fans flooded the comments with support, but none of it could touch the emptiness inside him. This is the cruel reality of grief. It doesn't end when the funeral does. It lingers. It festers. It isolates. And for Donald, it began to consume him. He still painted murals, but each one carried an undertone of sorrow. He still rapped, but his words trembled with vulnerability. Those who knew him best saw the truth. The light in his eyes was gone, and yet, the world still expected him to be strong. Friends called him a symbol of resilience. Fans looked to him for inspiration. But inside, Donald felt like a fraud. He wasn't resilient, he was broken. And no one, not his music, not his art, not even his community could fix the hole Razik's death had left behind. The weight grew heavier with each passing day. By mid-2025, whispers began to spread. People wondered if he was okay, if he was really coping, or if he was just pretending. He smiled for cameras, but those closest to him knew. The smile didn't reach his soul anymore, which leads us to the haunting truth. Grief doesn't always announce its breaking point. Sometimes it builds in silence, brick by brick, until one day the wall comes crashing down, and in Donald's case, that crash would come at the most heartbreaking place imaginable, the very grave where his son now rested. But the question remains. In those quiet moments before his final act, did Donald believe he was reuniting with Razik, or was he simply giving in to the silence that had already consumed him? Grief has no timeline. Some people learn to carry it, adapting to the absence like a phantom limb. For others, it never dulls, it deepens, until the weight becomes unbearable. For Donald Curtis, known to the world as Big Boss Dono, the death of his son Razik was not just a loss. It was the moment the ground gave way beneath him. In the weeks following Razik's funeral, Donald moved through life in fragments. Friends described him as present but distant, there but unreachable. He went through the motions, writing lyrics, painting murals, posting online, but the spark that had once defined him, his ability to light up a room with charisma, to pull people into his orbit, seemed extinguished. On Instagram, where he had once shared hopeful updates about Razik's treatment, his posts shifted into something darker. "I tried my best," he wrote in one caption, paired with a blurry photo of his son's toys. In another, he admitted, "I'm lost without you." Followers flooded the comments with prayers and encouragement. But grief is a wall no comment can break through. What most people didn't realize was how much Donald had been holding in. Behind the public tributes and carefully chosen words was a father drowning. His close friends said he would break down unexpectedly sometimes at the sight of a child in a grocery store. Sometimes when a song Razik loved came on the radio, he carried guilt like a second skin. Even though everyone told him there was nothing more he could have done, his art reflected this dissent. Murals that once celebrated bold colors and defiant hope now leaned toward shadows. The faces he painted seemed more sorrowful, the eyes more haunted, his raps slowed, the words less fiery, more fragile. He was, in many ways, documenting his own unraveling without fully realizing it. By mid-2024, a year after Razik's passing, Donald had stopped pretending. On his social media, he began speaking openly about depression. "I don't know how to keep going without him," he confessed in one haunting post. Another read, "When I smile, it's a lie. Inside, I'm dying every day." Fans responded with love, but some also expressed concern, sensing the depth of his despair. Yet despite the pain, Donald kept engaging with his community. He showed up to charity events, hosted local workshops, and collaborated with other artists. To those who only saw him in passing, he seemed resilient, a father honoring his son by continuing to live. But those closest to him knew better. Every time the lights dimmed and the crowd disappeared, Donald returned to the silence of an empty home, a silence he could not bear. One of the most telling moments came in late 2024. Donald visited Razik's grave and shared a photo of the headstone on Instagram. His caption read, "This is where my heart lives now. Everything I am, everything I ever wanted, is under this soil. I come here to breathe, but sometimes I wonder if I should just stay." The words were chilling, though most dismissed them as the raw venting of a grieving father. But for those who truly understood the language of despair, it was a warning. As 2025 unfolded, the pattern grew clearer. Donald's posts became less frequent, and when he did appear online, his words were heavy with finality. "If I don't make it, just know I loved him more than life itself." One message read. Another, "He's waiting for me. Maybe I'll see him soon." Behind closed doors, friends urged him to seek help. Some suggested therapy, others offered to sit with him so he wouldn't feel alone. Donald listened, nodded, even promised he would try. But depression has a way of convincing its victims that nothing can help, that no light will ever return. And for Donald, that lie began to feel like truth. Still, he kept his role as a father figure to the community. He mentored young rappers, encouraged artists, and continued speaking about resilience in interviews. It was the cruel paradox of his final year. Outwardly, he embodied strength. Inwardly, he was unraveling, faster than ever. The people closest to him recall how he spoke about Razik with a mixture of love and torment. "I hear his voice every night," he told one friend. "Sometimes I think he's calling me to come home." To another, he admitted, "I can't keep living like this. My body is here, but my soul is already with him." The night before his final act, Donald posted one last tribute to Razik. It was a simple image, a photo of his son, smiling at the camera, cheeks full, eyes bright. The caption read, "Forever, my king. Daddy loves you. Always." No one knew it at the time, but that post was a goodbye. The following day, the 8th of July, 2025, Donald drove to the cemetery where Razik was buried. The sky was gray, the air heavy. He parked his car a short distance away and walked slowly toward his son's grave. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a father making a quiet visit, paying respects. But Donald's heart carried an intention no one could see. He stood at the headstone for a long time, speaking words only he and his son would ever know. Then, with a silence that screamed louder than any cry, Donald made his choice. When cemetery staff later approached the site, they were met with a scene too devastating to describe. Donald Curtis, artist, rapper, father, was gone, his body resting beside the grave of the child he could never live without. The community that once looked to him for strength now faced a different kind of lesson. That even the strongest can break, and that grief, left unspoken, can become fatal. But there was one detail that stunned everyone who heard it. A detail found at the gravesite, left behind in Donald's final moments. A message so personal and so haunting that it would change the way people remembered not only his death, but his life. And it is in that final message that the true depth of his story is revealed. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the air heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. When groundskeepers came across Donald Curtis's body at his son's grave, they quickly called authorities. But as investigators arrived, it wasn't just the tragedy of his death that drew their attention. It was what Donald had left behind, something that would transform his passing from a private heartbreak into a story that resonated across the country. At the base of Razik's headstone lay a folded notebook, worn from use. It was Donald's personal journal, one he had been carrying with him for months. Inside, written in his uneven, hurried handwriting, were messages that revealed the full scope of his pain. These were not lyrics crafted for an audience, not polished words for social media. They were raw confessions, unfiltered and final. The first page carried a dedication. To my king, my Razik. This is all for you. From there, the entries unfolded like a map of a father's grief. Some passages were short, simple. I miss you. Others carried heavier weight. Every morning I wake up, and I hope it was all a dream. But then I see your empty bed. As investigators read through the journal, one section stood out. Dated just days before his death. Donald had written, "People think time heals. They're wrong. Time only teaches you how to hide the pain. But I can't hide it anymore. I tried for my fans, for the kids who look up to me, for the community. But every night, I go home and cry until I can't breathe. I see you everywhere. I hear you calling me. I know I can't stay here without you. I just want to hold you again. Forgive me, my son, but I'm coming home." The words were devastating. They painted a portrait of a man who, despite the love surrounding him, felt utterly alone in his grief. Next to the journal was a single sheet of paper, written more carefully than the entries inside. It was Donald's final note, a farewell meant to be found. It read, "Do not be angry with me. Do not think I gave up. I fought as hard as I could, but my heart is already buried here. I am not leaving this world in despair. I am leaving it to be with my son. Take care of the children out there. Teach them love. Teach them strength. Because that's what I wanted for Razik. Tell him I love him, always." Those who read the note later said it was impossible not to cry. It wasn't just a message of surrender. It was also a message of love. Even in his last moments, Donald was thinking about the children in his community, about leaving behind a lesson in compassion and resilience. News of his death and of the letter spread quickly. Within hours, social media erupted with tributes. Fans reposted his old performances, his murals, his interviews. The hashtag number "Long Live Dono" began trending, with thousands of people sharing how his music or his art had touched them. Many included their own stories of grief, turning his passing into a larger conversation about loss, depression, and mental health. But the impact was most profound in his hometown of St. Louis. Crowds gathered outside his studio, leaving candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. At Razik's grave, mourners placed teddy bears and balloons, symbols of the child whose short life had inspired so much love. The cemetery became a pilgrimage site not only for fans but also for parents who had lost children, finding in Donald's story a mirror of their own pain. Friends and collaborators stepped forward to speak. One fellow rapper said, "He was always the strongest guy in the room. He lifted everybody up. I wish we had known how heavy he was inside." A local pastor, who had worked with Donald on charity drives, added, He was a man of faith. But even faith doesn't erase grief. His note is a reminder that we must reach out to those suffering, even when they look strong. The police quickly confirmed that Donald's death was a suicide. No foul play was suspected. But the conversation didn't stop there. For many, the haunting words in his note raised bigger questions. How do we as a society care for grieving parents? How do we recognize the signs when someone is silently collapsing? And how do we talk about suicide without reducing it to a headline? Mental health advocates seized the moment to spread awareness. Hotlines were shared, community meetings were held, and schools in St. Louis began hosting workshops about grief and emotional resilience. Donald's passing, tragic as it was, became a catalyst for difficult but necessary conversations. Still, for those who knew him personally, it was not policy or awareness that mattered most. It was the man himself, the vibrant, larger-than-life figure who had poured his heart into art, into music, into fatherhood. His absence left a wound no campaign could heal. The journal was returned to his family, who chose not to release it publicly. But snippets of the final letter were shared with the media, ensuring that Donald's last words reached the community he loved. "Take care of the children," he had written, and those words became a kind of anthem. Local organizations began new initiatives in his name, supporting youth programs and creative workshops. His message of care lived on, even after he was gone, and yet, one detail continued to haunt those who followed the story. Among Donald's belongings at the grave was a small object tucked into the journal's back cover. A locket. Inside was a photo of Razik on one side, and on the other, a tiny slip of paper with just 2 words. "See you." No one knew if the words were meant for Razik, for the community, or for himself. But they carried an eerie finality, a sense that Donald had been walking toward this moment for a long time. In the end, what remained was not only the image of a father who could not bear to live without his child, but also the enduring reminder of how fragile even the strongest among us can be. His story became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror held up to a society still learning how to speak openly about grief and mental health. Yet as the community tried to heal, another chapter began to unfold, one that asked not just how Donald died, but how he should be remembered. Was his legacy defined by his final act, or by the life he lived before it? The answer to that question lies in the way people chose to honor him in the days, weeks, and months after his passing. And that is where the final part of this story leads us. When the funeral was held, the church could not contain the crowd. People spilled out onto the streets, holding candles, speakers playing Donald's music at low volume as if he were performing one last time. Inside, family and close friends wept openly, while others stood in silence, heads bowed in respect. On the altar, alongside his casket, rested a framed photo of Razik, the boy who had been at the center of it all, the spark that had lit his father's world, and the absence that had darkened it. The service was not only a farewell but a reckoning. Pastors spoke of Donald's generosity, his tireless energy in uplifting others, and his unshakable devotion. As a father, fellow artists remembered him as a mentor, someone who never hesitated to give advice, to share connections, to lift up the next generation. A friend summed it up best when he said, "Dono wasn't just a rapper, he was a builder. He built songs, he built art, he built community. And even in death, he built a legacy." That legacy revealed itself almost immediately. Local organizations announced the launch of the Razik Foundation, dedicated to supporting children who had lost parents or siblings. Fundraisers were held, with proceeds directed toward grief counseling, school scholarships, and creative programs for at-risk youth. The foundation's motto came directly from Donald's last note: "Take care of the children." Within weeks, murals began appearing across St. Louis. On brick walls and under highway overpasses, artists painted Donald's likeness side by side with Razak's, surrounded by symbols of resilience: doves, roses, crowns. The imagery transformed the cityscape into a living memorial, each mural a reminder of the father and son whose story had touched thousands. For the hip-hop community, Donald's passing carried its own weight. He had been more than a local act. He was a symbol of authenticity, of raw storytelling rooted in lived experience. His music, once celebrated mainly in underground circles, gained new traction after his death. Streams of his albums surged, and unreleased recordings were carefully remastered and shared by his collaborators. Fans described listening to his voice as both painful and healing. Painful because he was gone, healing because his words remained. Journalists began writing about the tragedy in national outlets, framing it within larger discussions about mental health in the Black community, about the silence surrounding men's grief, and about the unique weight artists carry when they are expected to be voices of strength while privately suffering. Donald's story became a case study in the need for open dialogue. Yet beyond the articles and social media campaigns, it was in the quiet acts of remembrance that his legacy took root most deeply. Parents who had lost children wrote letters to his family, thanking them for sharing his story, saying it gave them courage to speak about their own pain. Teachers incorporated his lyrics into writing assignments, asking students to analyze how music can be both art and therapy. Local musicians hosted tribute concerts, blending Donald's songs with their own, turning grief into collaboration. One of the most poignant tributes came from a group of teenagers Donald had mentored at a community center. They released a short film, shot on borrowed cameras, titled "For Dono." In it, they recited lines from his songs, intercut with footage of their neighborhood and interviews about how he had impacted their lives. The closing frame read, "You told us to be strong. We'll carry that for you." In many ways, Donald's story blurred the line between tragedy and triumph. His final act was heartbreaking, but it also cast light on the unspoken struggles that countless people endure. His openness, even in despair, allowed others to find language for their own grief. And in that sense, he continued to do in death what he had always done in life: give voice to the voiceless. But legacies are never simple. Some critics questioned whether the romanticization of his death risked overshadowing the darkness of suicide. Others argued that focusing too heavily on the tragedy might eclipse the vibrancy of his life, the music, the laughter, the fatherhood. His family responded by urging people to remember him as both a man of immense talent and love, and a man who suffered deeply after loss. To reduce him to either alone, they said, would be to miss the full truth. As months passed, the community began to heal, though the scars remained. The cemetery where Donald and Razak rested side by side became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors left flowers, sneakers, spray paint cans, even handwritten notes addressed to Razak, as though continuing the father's tradition of speaking to his son. And perhaps that was the most enduring part of the story: the way it drew strangers into a circle of remembrance. It wasn't only about one father and one son anymore. It was about all parents and children, about the universal bond of love and the universal pain of loss. In that sense, Donald and Razik became symbols far larger than themselves. In the end, what Donald Curtis left behind was not only music or murals, not only journals or letters, but a challenge to care for the children, for the grieving, for the strong who suffer in silence. His words echoed long after the candles burned out. Take care of the children. Teach them love. Teach them strength. And if his own story closed with heartbreak, the legacy it inspired was one of resilience, compassion, and collective responsibility. His death forced a community to confront difficult truths, but it also gave them the chance to rise together, to carry forward his vision of love and strength. As one mourner put it at his vigil, he and Razik are together now, but the rest of us, we're the ones who have to keep his promise. With that, the story of Donald Curtis, artist, father, community pillar, comes to a close. Not with the silence of a grave, but with the echo of a voice that refuses to be forgotten. A voice reminding us that grief is heavy, love is eternal, and legacy is built not in how we die, but in how we inspire others to live.